sure that Andrew was going to be in the frame of mind to be able to share with us as much as he has done. And so there'll be bits going further back and then going through in between as a kind of general tribute to the family. We've heard a little bit about the very earliest years. You know, as Philip and Andrew ran up and down the stairs at Kilthustag and went about the house, they were imitating the sound of tractors. One would go and the other would go the other way around in his mouth. So they spread that out. There was a day when there was the tale to tell that our old Ford van wouldn't start for some mysterious reason, and it transpired that Philip and Andrew had teamed up to fill the petrol tank with stones from the yard. And one of the earliest exploits was before Caley stopped coming with his threshing mill in autumn. About 1962, all the men had gone into the house for dinner, and afterwards when they returned to work, there were no sockets left in Caley's spanner box. Peering around at the back of the hacket, no barn in those days, they saw that the sockets had all been fired into the hedge. Philip was as much of a handful as his twin brother. Teased into irritation one day by John Quirk, the builder of our Dutch barns from Cronkavody, they threw handfuls of gravel at him. Well, a few stories from that time. Philip's first day at school went down in the Chronicle of Bride's School. He ran off in one direction while his twin brother ran off the opposite way. It had been planned. It took a whole year until they started speaking to other pupils, and another whole year until they talked to the teacher, Mrs. Cool. Just imagine that. It gave our parents cause for concern. But one day, one of their fellow pupils arrived home from school with the news of an exciting development at Bride's School. Today, the twins sat down. Philip often gave us cause for amusement, like once when he was so distracted as a 7-year-old standing on the trailer when he failed to notice that it had been disconnected from the tractor. So when Andrew drove off as a 7-year-old with the tractor, he was left behind shouting and waving his arms in dismay, while Herbie Allen from Sulby, then living at the Cronk, bent over in spasms of laughter. But Philip also proved he was a keen learner by asking lots of questions. He baffled us once after we'd sung a hymn by asking, "Who's Julie? I know about Jesus, but who's Julie? Whatever had we been singing? Oh Jesus, I have promised to serve thee to the end. We hope to follow Julie." Albert Road School in Ramsey was the next stage. A wise decision to allow the twins to repeat their first year there was unfortunately followed 12 months later by a foolish decision to skip the whole year they'd missed out and put them straight through to the third year. This undermined all the progress they'd made in the meantime and radically weakened their prospects at Ramsey Grammar School. Nonetheless, Philip had a lot of opportunities for laughter in those days, together with Andrew. There were all those larks and pranks, in particular with the school teacher they used to call Egghead, as well as that bus driver who often seemed to need to stand up to get the gears changed on the old school buses. Who would remember his name, I wonder? The Caley family was an academy of imitation, and Philip was a part of it. The main story of Ramsey Grammar School, as we've heard from Andrew, for Philip was, however, learning to play the violin with dedication and being discovered as a rare talent, both as regards his technical skills and the quality of the tone he could entice from his violin. He won prizes at the Manx Manx Music Festival and became leader of the Manx Youth Orchestra. He had both the artistic sensitivity and the passion, so it seemed, to make a future as a violinist. But then all of a sudden it broke off and plunged our mother into inconsolable distress. what had happened. He'd been told in no uncertain terms, in spite of what Andrew said there about his teacher, that he'd have no chance at all without good educational achievements across the board. And this negativity, I think, must have felt like a stab in the back, or being struck below the belt. It evidently cut him deeply, and more or less overnight he set out to replace everything sensitive and soft and effeminate, arguably, with muscular activity. He would never again be able to play his violin as he had done previously, but thankfully there was a deeper gentleness that remained within Philip, and later on he did find some reconciliation with his violin. Well, at the age of 15 he left school, and living on a farm had meant learning to drive tractors at a very young age. And Philip's calm and careful attitude at the steering wheel of cars impressed his driving examiner that much, as Andrew mentioned, that he was the only Caley boy to pass that test at his first attempt. Philip loved vehicles of all kinds, cars in particular. After a little green Morris van, he got himself a Fiat, next a Volvo, and then a grand plum-coloured Mercedes. Wondered where he was saving all the money from. And later it was a Ford Escort, and what else was there? I don't remember. One of the first opportunities for work that Philip found away from home was with Jeff Tier, Ballacrega Farm. So in between times, 1974 he worked for Arthur Caley, and then for his successor Hilton Dearden. The following year at Ballakesh, he then did a spell with Teddy Carouche at Reggaby Farm, 1976. There were spells in between at home as well. A build-up of inner dissatisfaction was exploding at times in aggressive behaviour. But when he heard a visitor talking about all the space for young men out in Australia, he turned his mind in that direction, and our father encouraged him, not least because he had always thought highly of emigrants to new worlds and was sure it would be a valuable challenge for Philip. Well, out in the Australian outback, he worked on 3 farms with the Roberts, the Dustings and the Dexters, though he was back at home in the Isle of Man for a longer spell in between, partly on the dole, or helping out John Lace and Ewan Ratcliffe on fine days, or doing a bit at Kilthostak, but also trying out a week at the Lindley Dairy. I don't know whether it's Lindley or Lindley anymore, so long ago, and another one at John Northern Motors. He was actually very interested in how engines work, just like his twin brother. Well, when he'd finally put Australia behind him, he stuck 5 months in the employment of J.D. Faulkner. Andrew mentioned that. But his travels were by no means over. He always managed to save enough money to go on holiday to Scotland, to Switzerland, once to Canada to visit his cousin Michael, and twice to Israel, which made a deep impression on him. And back at home in 1980, he was laying tracks for Manx Electric Railways, as well as operating the trams of the Snaefell Mountain Railway. 2 years later, he started working with the Jervy gang of the Highway Transport Board, and he was once on the job of cutting down tree branches on an open-decked bus, and later on the hedge trimmer. But after going to London to take his test as a bus driver, that was what Philip did the longest, working for the Isle of Man Road Services or Transport from 1990 onwards. He was a very gifted and competent driver. But bus driving increasingly meant being a conductor and a cashier as well. It was all that extra hassle and the pressure to keep time that stressed him, eventually to the limit. Back at home, Philip had a great fondness for our pet dogs and cats, even if he often gave them more intense attention than they truly enjoyed. He also developed a passion for cleanliness. Perhaps this was a symptom of the sensitivities of his mind. And one of these was the discomfort he felt when he heard people around him swearing. Philip took his Christian faith, as we've heard, very seriously. Had a strong faith. The thought that he might not be a good example or testimony to others would trouble him. And he was conscientious about tithing his income. Yes, the fellowship at the Bethel proved to be Philip's personal spiritual home, whatever other services he might attend elsewhere. There was a brief spell when he accompanied his brother James and sister-in-law Ouida to the Elim church, partially perhaps because of a quiet young lady he'd met there. And she'd not been the first to awaken Philip's interest. But then in the spring of 1992 he met Joy, the Philippine marine biologist in Port St. Mary. The marriage took place on the 30th of July 1994 while our father was still alive. Philip did all he could to clear the way for Joy to be free to start a family on the Isle of Man. And at first they lived in a pleasant flat on the North Promenade in Ramsey, the first home for Joshua, born the 4th of December 1996. A little later they moved to Snaefell View, a more spacious house on the Derby East housing estate, which remained their family home until only a few months ago. Philip continued his work as a bus driver, though not without the occasional crisis. So as soon as Joshua was going to school, Joy found part-time work in Douglas to supplement the family income. Joy will never forget how happy Philip was when Joshua was born, how he doted on his little boy, how good he was at changing nappies, as well as getting up in the night to feed him, even if he'd have to get up early the next morning for bus driving. Considering the conflicts of culture between Manx and Philippine backgrounds, and the problems Philip had at work, he remained a relatively happy man for a long time. That's how Joy sees it. They spent their holidays every other year in the Philippines, visiting Joy's sister Hetty and his mother-in-law. As long as he was out there, Philip would revel in the freedom to indulge a favourite hobby: swimming in warm water. There were several trips to California too, to stay with a niece, also called Joy, as well as a time in Atlanta, Georgia. Sister-in-law Astrid remembers Philip as a really good person, a deep Christian, protective, providing, and very loving both to his wife and his son. I'll not forget how he read to us from the Bible and the Daily Bread while we were still all together back in December 2014, staying with his niece out in California. The journey home was a place of welcome and many, many happy get-togethers with family, nieces and nephews. Philip was at ease within the security of his family triangle: Joy, Joshua, Philip. At first it was Josh learning from Philip, then Philip learning with Josh and from Josh, then getting left behind altogether by Joshua. But Joshua made generous allowances for his dad, not least for that unending compulsion to look for the next toilet, knowing that his dad was very proud of him. When Joshua disappeared on the 1st of January 2016, that treasured triangle was broken. Both parents were grieving sorely in their own ways, and Philip had no vocabulary to express his grief in words. Perhaps he'd have been best able to do that with the violin. He drew back into himself increasingly. While in California one last time a year ago, he'd go on walks on his own, trying to avoid socializing. He'd eat far too much and then be upset with himself, knowing full well it wasn't good for him. Something had snapped or broken down in his mind, and in the end he couldn't handle it anymore. At times he was so fixed on some thought, he'd be almost oblivious to the presence of others. According to the coroner's report, the immediate cause of Philip's death was cardiac arrest in consequence of asphyxia. The circumstances that led him to put an end to his life included, no doubt, that presumed death by drowning of his only child. On the 4th of December 2017, Joshua would have reached the mature age of 21, and it was the very next day that Philip took his life. He had invested a good deal in comforting his wife Joy with the reassurance he found in the Bible, but then his own inner questions craved answers that he was unable to find, and perhaps these were simply unanswerable questions. A whole variety of additional circumstances, including early retirement and moving to the farm as winter loomed, conspired, as it were, to drain the last sap out of any hope he could see for the future. His whole mental and bodily condition had deteriorated, so he had long been experimenting with the possibilities of suicide, not only in his mind. And Joy had undertaken a great deal to prevent it. But what he did at the end must have seemed to him to be the only way out of the maze in which he found himself, must have seemed like liberation, and therefore justifiable, logical, inevitable. And I feel sure, however, that he believed in God and was sure of God's love right up to the end. And I am convinced that he has now found perfect rest, freedom, and joy in the peaceful embrace of God's love. We give thanks for Philip.